Thank you, Andrea. Good morning and welcome. My name is Wendy Almanzan with the Houston-Galveston Area Council. We have a great webinar lined up for you today about disaster debris funding for local jurisdictions. Before we get started, I'm going to go over some general notes about event logistics. First, this meeting is being recorded. Microphones will be muted and cameras will be turned off throughout the presentation. If you are on your phone and unmuted, please go ahead and mute your phone. We will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. You can type in your questions anytime during the presentation. We'll be monitoring the chat and the questions will be read at the end. If you are attending this webinar via telephone only and prefer to ask your question verbally, you can press *9 to raise your hand and we'll call on you to unmute during the question portion of the workshop. If you have any issues at any time during the webinar, just type them into the chat box and Andrea or I will help you out. Now I'd like to welcome John Burry with Tetra Tech, who will introduce his team and dive right into the presentation.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you so much, Andrea, and the entire H-GAC team. We appreciate the opportunity to have this meeting today, this virtual webinar. I think the subject is going to be very timely when it comes to this hurricane season and preparations that are going on for many jurisdictions as we get into those peak summer months and into the early fall. Allison, if you could move to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, my name is John Burry. I'm a director of post-disaster programs with Tetra Tech here in Houston. I have been with our team since 2001 and have supported many of H-GAC's activities associated with disaster planning and disaster debris management planning. I've had the privilege of working with many local governments throughout the state of Texas, as well as throughout the U.S. in responding to and preparing for, responding to, and recovering from disasters. I looked at the attendee list and see a few familiar faces, but quite frankly, there's a lot of folks that I know are maybe new to this webinar and this workshop, and therefore, I think this is going to be a good introduction for the topic of disaster debris management funding, as well as some of the other funding related activities and funding related opportunities that are out there. Joining me today is a couple of my colleagues, Mr. Brian Rutherford and Ms. Allison McCleary, who are going to be co-hosting this presentation today. And Brian, you want to go take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Brian Rutherford. I've been with Tetra Tech for 14 years and been involved in a number of different response and also a lot of the preparedness planning projects in the region as well as across the country. So it's a pleasure to be with you.
And Allison.
Sure. Hi, guys. I'm Allison McCleary. Have the pleasure to work with John and Brian at Tetra Tech. I'm newer to Tetra Tech. I've been there a little over a year, about a year and a half, after serving 18 years in the public sector. So managing and administering FEMA public assistance and other federal grant programs. So I support our team, I support our operations, and John and the client liaison team as well. So glad to be here today, glad to make your acquaintance for everyone on the call, and hoping to give a great overview of disaster debris management, but also some ways to get those activities funded. So most importantly, thanks, John.
Thanks, Allison. And Allison and I, pack a 1-2 punch when it comes to some of the policy challenges with her background in serving in a lead role in recovery for the state of Louisiana and the state of Florida. She has a lot of incredible perspective on working with local jurisdictions as well as providing the perspective, at that state level. So today we have a time allotted about 1 hour and 30 minutes. And so we'll be taking you all to the 11:30 hour or half hour there. And again, we want to just go ahead and dive right in. So the purpose of this webinar today is not only discuss disaster debris funding options, but some of the other recovery related funding opportunities that are available to local jurisdictions. And several of these are, I guess, traditional funding, but some of them are new to the, to local governments, and, you may have heard about them. And so what we want to be able to do is provide that baseline understanding of, these funding programs and how they apply to disaster debris, but how they might mitigate future risks within your community, and how they might be able to prevent these issues from occurring in the future. So we're going to take a more traditional, but a little bit of a different angle to disaster debris, and look at the entirety of recovery operations. Next slide, please. And before I turn it over to Allison to lead today's webinar, I wanted to talk about our agenda. So we broke things out into two buckets. For those of you who I had the pleasure of working with, I like, my mind works in buckets. I think it's got it easier for people to understand, and at least for me to understand. But we want to look at those primary disaster funding sources, and those would be the FEMA Public Assistance Program, as well as FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Program. We wanted to look at the U.S. Department of Transportation's Federal Highway Administration program and their emergency relief activities, as well as the USDA's National Natural Resource Conservation Service, the NRCS, and their Emergency Watershed Protection Program. In addition to that, we're going to spend some time looking at other recovery-related funding, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, which was recently passed and signed into law by the President, the American Rescue Plan Act, which it was also recent in the last 2 years, as well as a longstanding program called, HUD's CDBG Disaster Recovery Program. So, again, with this, and that, what we're going to look at as that nexus to debris, but also the whole of community, which I think is very important, and that's something that is talked throughout the industry. When Allison and I have had a chance to go to many national conferences, it is that idea of the whole community, or the whole of community recovery, that we look at when it comes to disaster recovery. I would say that by and large, the preponderance of our presentation today is going to be spent on FEMA's Public Assistance Program, but many of these other programs may be of interest and certainly applicable to you as a leader within your organization if you are impacted by a disaster. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allison. We're going to go ahead and get started and talk about our first funding program there with FEMA Public Assistance.
Great, thanks, John. Yep, a little bit before I dive into PA actually is the funding sources available on the screen. Some of them, as John said, are pre-existing, well-funded, annually funded, or just actually unlimited funds available for response and recovery activities, whereas others are subject to congressional appropriation and just really aren't as well funded. That's why we're going to focus on FEMA PA. That's our bread and butter. I mean, that's going to be not only pay for your debris pickup and your response activities, but also infrastructure recovery and things like that. And they've really had some great tweaks to the public assistance program, even in leading towards mitigation and making communities even more resilient within that program itself. We've been really, I was going to say lucky, blessed. I don't know what the word is necessarily, but we've been granted a lot of additional funding through the IIJA and ARPA, both through those pre-existing programs and creating new ones. So we really wanted to highlight all of it because there's going to be some things that you guys may not have heard before. And that's kind of rare in disaster response and recovery, to truly have new funding sources, unprecedented levels of funding. So really wanted to give you guys the full picture. So primarily, as we mentioned, FEMA Public Assistance will be oftentimes your number one, your primary source of funds to help your community respond to and recover from disasters. So FEMA, through the passage of the Stafford Act many decades ago, created a public assistance program where the federal government can provide assistance to state, local governments, and as well as territories and tribes and private nonprofits that provide both critical and non-critical services to communities. So it's available, whether it's an emergency declaration, which triggers only part of the program, or a major disaster declaration that triggers the full suite of programs available. Both are available. It very much depends on the nature and the severity of the incident, but it is a full service program to help you respond to and recover from disasters.
Certainly, Allison, there's no shortage of FEMA public disaster declarations. I feel that Texas, Louisiana, Florida are on the Mount Rushmore of disasters. And, if you had not dealt with the FEMA public assistance program for a natural disaster, but maybe you dealt with it during the COVID-19 pandemic response, it's certainly something that is, you need to become familiar with, as it is really that first line of defense when it comes to big debris operations and providing additional assistance to local governments.
And John, debris, to that point, debris oftentimes is the largest cost involved with natural disasters, especially. So that's why it's just really, really important. And FEMA provides this assistance, as I mentioned, to all of these, private nonprofits, state and local governments. It encourages, and a good thing that I mentioned as far as tweaks within the public assistance program, it's been around for many decades, but FEMA has been very forward thinking with their utilization of mitigation activities funded through the public assistance program. So not only will they give you funding to help you staff your EOC or conduct debris operations, rebuild City Hall or your hospitals or something like that, they've also in recent years been providing funding to build back better. So to mitigate against the damages that they see for those specific facilities while building back, while recovering. So it's a great funding source available just under FEMA public assistance. And the best way to describe it is not only building back, but building back stronger and more resilient.
One of the things I'll just encourage everybody on today's webinar, when you create your recovery team, you create that team that's going to be responsible for FEMA public assistance. I think it's important to set some goals when it comes to mitigation funding, and whether it's 25 cents for every dollar, 50 cents, or perhaps even a lofty goal of trying to achieve a dollar for dollar, your damages to mitigation, your repair costs to building it back. I think that's important for you as a local government to look at, just understanding that we don't want to be in this position in the future. We want to make sure that we have those, that we do build it back better. And so, again, I challenge you all to look at it under that lens. I think it's something that is often, has gotten overlooked in the past.
So FEMA years ago had a variety of policies and procedures that applied to their public assistance program, just kind of scattered. They were whether or not you found them in a certain guidance series, the 9500 series, or found them online, or FEMA would issue them specific to certain events or certain topics. Thankfully, a couple of years ago, they decided to combine those and to create a program and policy guide. We lovingly call it the Papa G. And it's in its fourth iteration now, issued a couple of years ago and effective for all events from that date forward. And it's a great resource. Finally, all FEMA's policies applicable to the public assistance program are in one place. There's examples of documentation that's required for each type of claim and each type of category of work. And it's a terrific resource. So if you happen to be unfamiliar with FEMA's public assistance program and haven't had to navigate that before, it's a great place to start. It gives you a great overview of the program itself.
Allison, I have been in several EOCs or recovery offices where they've got that printed copy of the Papa G, and it's tabbed out. It's got, it has highlights throughout the entire thing. It's got the most important areas, identified. And I would highly encourage, this is one of those documents, as Allison referred to, the Papa G. I mean, again, it's the Bible, if you will. I would highly encourage everybody to print that out. I mean, I know we don't do a lot of paper these days, but this is one where I'll tell you, I got my printed and bound copy on my desk, or in my desk rather, and have it tabbed out, understand where things are. And, you really need to understand it and read it, because that is the gold standard, if you will, of, recovery and the PA program.
The old adage, right, John? Don't leave home without it.
That's right. Exactly.
So we're not, the FEMA Public Assistance Program is a terrific program that's available. It's funding available for these activities. Doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's fast, but it is impactful. And so this is a snapshot of how FEMA delivers the program to state and local governments and applicants. So there's a lot of steps here, starting from the incident occurring and you getting a ballpark of your damages. Step one is we have to know what the impacts of that event were. It has to be of such a severity and nature that you need a supplemental federal assistance. It's beyond the capabilities of state and local government. So, hey, FEMA, please come help. We need your additional funding. And so right off the bat, do a damage assessment preliminarily, figure out what's been affected. Is it really mainly debris, or do you have infrastructure, road and bridge damage, or culverts washed out, et cetera? So you do have 30 days. The state has 30 days to request a declaration. Oftentimes there's a lot of pressure to put that in a lot sooner than 30 days, but you do actually have to help capture that. So one of the best things that local governments can do at this point is conduct thorough assessments and provide that information to the state, give them the ammunition they need to be able to really craft a great request to FEMA to show that they need supplemental assistance. So, as much as information as you can provide to and through the state, that'll lead to a more full declaration, a quicker declaration, and really help your state flesh out and describe that need to the president and to FEMA. Once you're declared, the state will conduct applicant briefings. One of their responsibilities is to make sure that you guys know the basics of the program. And so that's everything from just the incident period, the period of time in which FEMA will fund certain activities, who's been declared, which counties are included in the declaration, the nature of the assistance that's available. And then they'll tell you some deadlines. There's some immediate deadlines that happen that you have to actually apply for the program. It's not an automatic, you're not automatically opted in or anything like that. You as state and local governments have to actually file a request for public assistance. That's where you see an RPA. You do actually have to request public assistance. And so it's a very simple form. It's very simple to submit electronically. Will only take a few minutes for local governments, but it's a necessary step. And you do have to do that within 60 days of 30 days of the declaration. Once that's approved, FEMA will assign you a liaison, a customer service rep. They call them program delivery managers, PDMGs. They'll actually assign you a customer. I like to call them customer service reps. They're really there to help you navigate the program, to be that liaison, to gather documentation and help you submit and help you navigate not only their online portal, but also the program itself. So FEMA has some pretty robust deadlines on them as well. And so one of the first things that your program delivery manager will ask of you is to conduct a recovery scoping meeting. They have to figure out the nature and scope of what your damages are, kind of ballpark what your claims to them will be. Once you get assigned a program delivery manager, they really would like for you to schedule that recovery scoping meeting within about 3 weeks, within 21 days. If you're not ready, say don't agree to a recovery scoping meeting. The recovery scoping meeting actually starts some regulatory deadlines that FEMA doesn't or has very little latitude to extend. And so my best advice at this stage would be talk to your PDMG. If you've been hit hard or just have staffing issues or whatever the delay may be, express that to them and don't hold that recovery scoping meeting until you're ready. It does trigger a 60-day regulatory deadline in which you have to identify and report all your damage. So make sure you're ready before you really jump in and start navigating this program. As I mentioned, you have 60 days to identify and report all that damage. They're not expecting you to know exactly what it's going to take to build back everything, but you do have to be able to identify the general nature, scope, and extent of the damages. Make sure at least you capture where things are damaged, which types of things are damaged. You don't necessarily have to say City Hall requires $1 million of repairs to the roof and the plumbing and stuff, and detail that out. But you do have to say City Hall was damaged, and it would include the roof, and you'd have to give some general idea of what the nature of the damages are. After that, your PDMG will work with you to develop a project scope and costs to help identify what the nature of the damages are and what you would need to build back. That's all sent through FEMA's process, where they look at the nature of those damages and they actually craft what's called a project worksheet. That's really your grant. It outlines the scope of what you can do, and it gives you a dollar amount of the dollars in which you can perform that work. So that is your grant. Upon obligation of that grant, when FEMA agrees to your scope and cost and issues you that money, obligates that money to you, they send it to the state, and then you then work with the state to draw down that money. You do that on a reimbursement basis as the work's complete, and there are some additional documentation requirements that the state can require for you to be able to access that money. That can include even, guys, canceled checks and bank statements and proofs of payment, and you really get into some detail to demonstrate that you've incurred those costs. That's in a nutshell. That's the program through actually building back. I want to give John an opportunity before I get into exit briefings and what might come thereafter. This is a long process, guys, and what I said in 2 minutes will take years.
Exactly. I was looking at this graphic that is published by FEMA, and for everybody out there to understand, those first 3 columns will happen in a blink of an eye. This will, again, you look at things in disaster terms, you'll be, recovering from, probably a unprecedented event in your lifetime. And those 3, the pre-declaration, applicant collaboration, and subaward formulation will occur in a 60, 90, 120-day process. Now that 4th column, which Allison's about to get into, is really the long haul. And for that, again, I want to make sure everybody understands having a recovery team together, to work as a team, whether it is to collect documentation, it's a support group. I feel like half the time, in disasters, we're all, one big recovering support group from disasters. So that's helpful to talk through some of the issues and just to make sure that, during that time, I can't encourage you enough to utilize the resources at the state as your partner and as your collaborator. And Allison, I'd love to hear your perspective being at the state and that lifeline, for local governments. I know there's a lot of cities and counties. I also, see Valerie Blanton, who's the state's, debris czar guru, if you will, on there. Could you talk a little bit about how local governments, you would recommend local governments talk to or reach out to the state and utilize the state during this process?
Absolutely. So I've administered this FEMA public assistance program in 2 different states, in 2 different FEMA regions. And yep, they really are. The state is the grant recipient. So the state is your conduit to FEMA and through which you get your funding. And so there's great resources available at the state. John mentioned whether it's debris experts, it's those that can help you plan pre-event, for what you may need as far as permitting or documentation expectations that you should put on your staff or contractors that you may have. We want to be very clear, and I know the state does too, as far as what your expectations are. It never should be a gotcha game. It never should be unclear. So if it is unclear as far as what's maybe required of you at a certain point in time, or if you're unclear about a deadline or what you might need to capture to help support scope and cost, the state is always available to you to help you navigate the program. I oftentimes say it's a great funding source and it's a great resource, but it's going to be some of the hardest dollars you've ever earned. or ever collected. And it doesn't necessarily need to be. The program is difficult enough, but having resources like the state, liaisons that the state makes available to you and your region, who've been there before. What we're seeing these days, John, and you mentioned COVID, what we're seeing is some turnover at state and local governments, local governments especially, maybe a little bit of burnout, and some new staff is serving in roles, or either new staff or old staff serving in new roles. And if you're unclear about what's expected, I would hate, and I always did as a state administrator, I don't want you to ever miss out on funds because of a deadline or because you're missing a piece of paper. I just want, the only time you might not get an award would be you're truly not eligible, or something actually, I don't want it to be for something procedural that could have been prevented. And I know the state does as well. So any questions that you have, ask the state, ask your liaisons that they provide. They're a terrific resource for you. As I mentioned, they've been there before and can tell you exactly what FEMA expects. FEMA does tend to, it's easier to navigate FEMA's processes if it's a recognizable package of information, if it's the terms or what they're expecting to see. And so the state can help you with some of that. Just providing a narrative of, we always jokingly call it the dark and stormy night, right, John? FEMA is not always on the ground and immediately thereafter. So sometimes it's not real clear some of the actions that you had to take. And one of the things that we would help do when I was at the state of Florida was help just provide context, tell applicants and tell local governments, give FEMA some context. You're not always going to be dealing with FEMA personnel who are there on the ground. They may be in another state helping to write up your grant. So make sure that they're aware of kind of what your community had to navigate and what occurred. And the state can help you with that as well. The state really serves as your advocate. And I know that in Region 6, working hand in hand with the FEMA regional administrator there and his staff, they're very collaborative and very available, and really work hand in hand to help you successfully navigate the program. So once FEMA actually obligates the funds and you start performing all this work, you start building back better. You do have to have a mind towards closing out this grant. I was talking earlier today actually about, accounting for every dollar. It sounds wild to think that you might have $1 billion disaster and you're having to provide bank statements and proofs of payment and proving up every dollar spent, but it's really an expectation of closeout, and it's and you do have to account for dollars spent and make sure it was spent on eligible activities and a reasonable cost. And so once you finish work, there are deadlines that you do have to submit to close out your project, to close out your grant, to account for all the dollars spent, and then ultimately close out that grant. I'm not going to say there's not possible audits to follow. FEMA, and actually through legislation, Congress has taken some great steps to help lessen that. It used to be the case that many years down the road, we would get audits, and it would be difficult to navigate. Now, at least there's a shortened time frame. Will have some certainty that your grants are closed, and your audits will come more quickly, and hopefully you can navigate those and truly be done. And the state can close out the award. There's still some states that have events open for a couple decades. Large scale events take a very long time, and then the state will then close out that event with FEMA.
And Allison, during that first year, when after disaster, when the FEMA conducts their validate as you go, the VAGO audits, which I know you're familiar with, debris is often the one that they come first. Those are the largest big ticket items during that first year. Those are the ones that have been likely funded through a expedited mechanism of some sort, or again, it's the ones that often, like I said, just oftentimes get selected. So being prepared for those audits and understanding that these audits might not come years and years and years down the line, but they could come in the first year of those years at any time, right? That's super important to recognize during this delivery process.
Absolutely. So it is a cost share program. So by law, you will never, the federal government will pick up not less than 75% of all eligible costs. FEMA can increase that cost share just automatically by regulation, up to 90% if certain thresholds are met or if an event is severe enough. What we've been seeing in recent years is not very consistently, but we are seeing an increased cost share made available for certain periods of time, whether that's limited to certain categories of work like debris, or for certain periods of time, whether it's 15 days, 30 days, even 60 days. They'll afford an increased cost share for a period of time, just recognizing that that's the greatest burden on applicants is those costs in those early days. So the state is your advocate. Will work with FEMA to set what those timeframes are. And again, not to say it's not automatic, it's not guaranteed at all, but we have been seeing it pretty regularly with large scale events where there is some increased cost share where you'll get additional federal funding for a certain period of time for certain categories of work.
And Allison, in that increase, I know I'm thinking back to Hurricane Laura in 2020. I know the state was very active there in Louisiana with collecting data to support that claim and making, that it known. I mean, I know COVID being 100% federally declared disaster, and even some of the COVID legislation providing some supplemental assistance to open disasters. During non-COVID disasters during that COVID period.
Yep. Yeah, they really took advantage of the opportunity to increase the cost share for all events during a certain period of time. They just really, recognized that there was an economic burden on communities around the country, and recognized that disasters and even the cost share associated with disasters, it was a burden. And so part of some of the COVID relief was to increase the cost share by law in those instances. It is discretionary, that FEMA, the president through FEMA can issue that. For what I'm talking about, those would happen to be actually by congressional action. So that's even better. But at least there's some confidence here. And I want you guys to know there is some confidence that it will never be less than 75%. So what additional funding they may throw into the pot is discretionary or subject to further congressional allocation. So FEMA had, again, a great step forward. We talked about the Papa G. Another step forward that happened in 2017 is FEMA transitioned to an online grants portal. So they use Grant Manager to not only submit and review requests for public assistance, but to submit those damage inventories that I mentioned, to develop and review projects. There's a lot more visibility there utilizing Grants Portal. You can track the status of your project development. You can see where it is in certain queues. You can see just your progress as you navigate the FEMA Public Assistance Program. That's your primary way you'll communicate and document communication to and through FEMA and with the state. It'll be captured all in Grants Portal. That's where you'll upload documentation such as insurance policies, payroll policies, states of emergency, declarations of states of emergency, things like that. So that's your one-stop shop as far as FEMA is concerned, at all documentation related to your projects. So FEMA does obligate funding for certain categories of work, and that's how they describe them, as categories of work. So the categories are here. Categories A and B are referred to as emergency work, and that's your debris and emergency protective measures. I'll discuss some details of those in just a minute. And then the C through G categories are what they call permanent work. They give you obviously longer to complete. The timeframes reflected here are subject to extensions that both the state has within their authority to give you, and then later FEMA has authority to provide you additional time in which to complete the work as well. But FEMA provides funding across all of these categories for disaster caused damages.
Allison, I oftentimes when I'm trying to explain this program to folks who aren't as familiar with the FEMA Public Assistance Program, maybe they're new in local government or not, like I said, more familiar with other grant programs. But I'll tell you, this is almost one grant program that should be two. Whether you have, and I think you got to keep that in mind, is that, categories A and B really focused on a reimbursement-based program for things that you did or things that you're going to do in the 30, 60, 90, 180 days. But looking at C through G, that's like a CIP program, a capital, a capital improvement program. And so some of the players may be different. You have your maybe you have an A and B team and your C through G team. so when you're organizing your recovery and you're looking at things like debris, or maybe a city hall was impacted, or a wastewater treatment plant, those are often two different folks that or maybe it's some of the same folks, depending on the type of disasters. But I can't stress enough is that when you look at this program, the red and the blue couldn't be more appropriate for showing that distinction between the two programs. I mean, whether it's days to completion, but really just the type and the nature of the program is different.
Absolutely. And the nature of what you'll have to document, the nature, everything is different. And the time frame is significant. So wanted to get into a little bit and highlight a few of the categories and how FEMA defines them. So we think we understand what constitutes debris, but FEMA does require that the debris meets these criteria. And so, your debris removal activities have to eliminate threats to life, public health, and safety, or eliminate significant damage to public or private property. I always say when you get into talking about private property debris removal, or vehicles and vessels, or some of the more intricate kind of subsets of debris, I call that 300 level FEMA. Right of way pickup and really clearing your roads and then picking that up, debris, mostly vegetative debris that you see on right of ways. That's what's known to all of us. That's what we all think of when we think of debris removal. But FEMA will also pay for things like pick up on private property with proper approvals, private roads, whether that's beaches, think of, damages on beaches, that's debris, sand is debris in some instances. A vessel washed up could be on a roadway, could be debris. And so there's lots of ways to think of debris, and FEMA will pay for all of that, all the things that I just mentioned. I said subject to certain approvals and navigating that process outlined in the POP-G. But debris removal is not only right-of-way debris. That may be the vast majority of the costs in the work that we see, but there are also enough. I mean, I'm thinking carcasses, right, John? I'm thinking animals, putrefied waste. I mean, if you really think of what some jurisdictions may face, FEMA does provide for all of those instances, and we'll work with you to really remediate what you see in your community.
And when we are talking about the financial impacts, I can't underscore enough how incredibly costly debris removal is. I know Allison during the opening talked about how this is, category A, I think constitutes 45%, 80% of the costs of the FEMA public assistance program, and it truly is. So being prepared for the cost and how you're going to work, whether it's your contractor or whether it's your force account, your own internal city forces, maybe it's through mutual aid, understanding and bringing your finance department to the table to ensure that you have the proper bandwidth to withstand the duration that it may take. I know in a couple of areas, I'm thinking of Bay County, Florida, which was impacted by the nation's last category 5 hurricane in the Panhandle. And Allison, I know you were with the state at that time. I mean, I think they went out and secured $200 million in bonds or in some supplemental funding just to pay for debris removal.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I mean, again, it's a tremendous costly mission, and it's one that is certainly worth being aware of it and just having that sensitivity associated with it.
Absolutely, John. And that significant cost incurred, you're right. I mean, Bay County, think about a really a smaller county, having to take on an additional $200 million immediately. I mean, it's not like they couldn't perform this work either. It wasn't discretionary. I mean, this work had to be performed. It was required really to even start work to bring their community back. You have to clear the roads. And so absolutely. And that becomes a significant cost. And I know that, I was at the state of Florida at the time, and I know the state of Texas will help work with you through that. I know that there's mechanisms, like you said, it's emergency work, it's work performed. It's work that needs to be performed. And so I know that there's some steps you can take both pre-event to help streamline or help navigate some of the requirements thereafter. Making sure you have your payroll policies, in place, making sure you understand how you're going to document, as you mentioned, your force account, your own work. Just making sure that you're mindful of that before an event will really help set you up for more success and hopefully either quicker access to your money on the backside as well.
And if I could say one more and make one more plug for H-GAC, they have a tremendous number of resources that are available on the website that talk about, Category A and really into the details. If you really want to deep dive into some of these programs that Allison had mentioned, whether it's beaches or whether it's, animal carcasses, some of the higher level, those 300 series debris programs, we've got a lot of information from the 100 all the way up to the what I would say 800 series debris programs. And so they got a lot of information out there and it are great resources for local governments.
It's terrific. So category B, just to quickly, if you have to staff emergency operations centers, search and rescue operation, what we traditionally think of as response activities are all paid for under category B. Category C, where as John said, we're into the infrastructure projects now, right? Category A and B are response and, emergency protective measures. C through G are really those infrastructure projects, the building back, restoring your communities. So Cat C includes roads and bridges, and does not include roads that you don't maintain, bridges you don't maintain, doesn't include private roads for the most part. As I mentioned, there's some exceptions, very, very intricate and outlined in the Papa G. And then the Federal Highways Administration does have an ER program that John will reference in a little bit, where we'll talk about where they have funding sources available for roads over which they have jurisdiction. Some of the highlights here to mention are FEMA's going to ask for the condition of the roads and bridges. They're going to ask for maintenance records. They're going to ask for anything that you can do to show the status and the condition of these roads and bridges prior to the event. We need to lead them to highlight for them the disaster caused damages, what we're expecting them to pay for. They've become very sensitive in recent years, I'll say really since 2016, and do about maintenance records and only paying that for that which was caused by the disaster itself. Category D, I'm sorry for the mistake there. It's not emergency protective measures, water control facilities, which includes dams, levees, reservoirs, drainage channels, sediment bases, aqueducts. Most oftentimes we'll see pump stations here, lift stations. Those are most commonly claimed here. But the FEMA program does not include facilities where you can get funding through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or NRCS that we'll mention a little bit, or another federal funding agency. Sometimes those other federal funds or other federal programs are underfunded, and there's some limited circumstances where you can access FEMA public assistance if those other funding sources just aren't sufficient. Category E are buildings and equipment. So this is probably the most common category claimed, depending on the nature of the event. Sometimes roads and bridges if it's a flooding event, but most commonly if it's a wind event like a hurricane, category E will be your most commonly claimed. This is buildings. This is building structural components. Think of if you take a building, the building itself, turn it over, shake it out. That's what you're left with are the structural components and not the contents. They'll also pay for vehicles damaged by the disaster. I've even seen this include street sweepers. Think of any types of equipment that your public works or solid waste departments have. Anything that you're responsible for and is utilized by your jurisdiction is eligible. They will deduct the costs of any damage covered by insurance, whether that's an internal risk pool, whether you're self-insured, or whether it's a commercial policy. You do have to account for every dollar of insurance, and you do have to take reasonable efforts to claim those and make those insurance claims. Just having the insurance itself, and you're just saying, oh, we're not covered. Oftentimes FEMA will require proof of your efforts to pursue that insurance, and you do have to show them that. And also, if people won't pay for any damages caused by neglect or accidental damages, you do have to take reasonable measures. John, anything you want to add about Cat E? I know, like I said, it's most commonly claimed. It's a high dollar item as well.
It is. It's one of those things right behind debris, which have the most cost. And, Allison, one of the things I've seen a lot of local governments ask for is, how does debris relate to some of these permanent categories of work? And, is this should we claim it as category A, or should we, is it part and parcel of the, of the category E project worksheet? And one of the things I've heard a lot of folks talk about is grouping or logical groupings and things like that. And I wanted to see if you could provide some perspective on that.
Yep, for sure. So if you have, damages, say a building, and it has a 200-year-old oak tree that, fell through the middle of City Hall. And so whether or not really the debris, Cat A debris, is really meant for as an emergency protective measure, to protect the general public, maintain public safety, clear ingress and egress of your roadways. So it's really meant to be, an emergency protective measure. I would say a 200-year-old oak that's sitting in the middle of City Hall, and you're maybe 8-10 months in and starting work there and have to remove that tree to start rebuilding and remediate. That's not necessarily debris removal. I mean, it is vegetative debris, but it's part and parcel of your recovery and replacement and repair of that building. And so it's really, I want to say, it's funny to say, I think a lot of people on the call will even laugh when I say a logical grouping. And when FEMA says logical grouping, logical to me and logical to you and logical to FEMA may not always be the same thing. But that's where, you make the arguments, you craft what makes sense for you and your community's recovery. If it's not making sense to FEMA and they don't see your logic, then get the state involved to help you make those arguments. But really it's whatever logically makes sense to be included in the cost of recovery and repair of that facility itself, or a collection of facilities. Sometimes it's schools for a while were built where they had a series of buildings connected with overhangs, and walkways, is that it's a series of buildings, but it's one facility, and we even get into, I'm getting way in the weeds here, but of continuous roof lines and things like that. But really just what makes logical sense for you and your community's recovery is what you need to think and have in mind. So category G, parks. I think this will be most impactful. I know I had Cat F there. I'm not sure where that went. Utilities. But know that utilities are available under category F. If you're a municipal or co-op owned utilities, that's available. Oftentimes that's mutual aid and recovery there. But category G for you guys, especially in local government, is oftentimes an expense there too. So think mass transit facilities, parks, piers, docks, campgrounds, picnic tables, golf courses, etc. So again, parks in use, parks maintained facilities. They won't cover replacement of trees, shrubs, or ground cover. Really, they're going to make it safe. They won't necessarily make it pretty, is what I like to say, except if it's used for ground stabilization and things like that. And private nonprofits aren't eligible to claim their parks or recreational facilities as Cat G. So I definitely want to hit on this because one of the things I often say in my talks is document, document, document. When you think you've documented, document some more. And so wanted some examples of documentation that FEMA will typically require. So if you're using things out of your own stock, they'll want to know your inventory pre-disaster and then what you used, and actually show them, not just say you took it out of stock. You're going to have to show that you own or have legal responsibility for your facilities. That includes roads, bridges, but also buildings. Oftentimes with the adoption of a charter school model, for example, sometimes legal responsibility for certain facilities are shifted. And so just be aware that you will have to shore up your legal responsibility to perform the work on those facilities. You'll have to show full insurance policies, including deck pages. If you utilize contracts or mutual aid, you'll need those hopefully pre-disaster contracts, the actual written documents uploaded. FEMA wants to see and read all of that. They're going to want records of contract work, of work performed. For your rented equipment, they'll want those contracts and invoices, any records of costs incurred. They're going to want to see if you're claiming your own time or your employees' time. They're going to want to see your overtime policy. Disasters don't just work 8 to 5. So oftentimes everyone will be on deck incurring lots of overtime in a big instance. And FEMA is going to want to see that you, one, had a pre-disaster overtime policy or payroll policy in place that was not contingent upon FEMA coming into play, and that you followed it. It's one thing to have a policy, but it's another that you have to actually follow it. And so just know, go back to your communities, if you would, after this, and just read over to make sure your policies, to make sure it doesn't say, in the event of a federally declared disaster, you get double time instead of time and a half or something like that. I've seen those in the states that I've administered. And so just know that that's a huge red flag, and it can't be contingent upon FEMA coming into play. They're going to want to see rental and lease agreements. Oftentimes, if you have historical buildings or historical facilities within your communities, that's one of those 300 level FEMA programs, John. Historic preservation. There's a lot more there, but if you have historic facilities and maintenance records, last but not least, the pièce de résistance, maintenance records.
Allison, I was going to say to the folks out here attending this, I would highly encourage you to on your keyboard, find the function button and then the print screen button, and copy this one and take a screenshot of this and print it out, or print screen something, because this one right here, if you want to put that into your as a supplemental page to your recovery manual, your copy of your Papa G. I mean, this is a simple go-to list of just really those commonly required items that you as the recovery director, that documentation hub, if you will, are going to need. And the other thing I would highly encourage everybody to do is talk to or perhaps conduct a hot wash or conduct a after action with COVID-19. Everybody was impacted by COVID-19, and many folks had sought FEMA assistance because of the fact that all 50 states and U.S. territories were eligible under the program. That was a great exercise in category B, and so understanding a lot of these things, of course, your insurance policies aren't going to be required, or building codes and standards aren't going to be needed, but a lot of these elements were, and whether it's inventory or legal responsibility, work records, those things were all part and parcel to the disaster. So kind of doing that hot wash, as Allison mentioned, going back and looking at some of these codes is a great way to prepare yourself for the next hurricane, tornado, ice storm, wind event, something that might impact your community on the natural disaster side that you can be better prepared for.
Absolutely. So John, I want to talk a little bit about hazard mitigation funding. So it's one thing to have to deal with the effects of a disaster and recover from it, but hopefully we can help mitigate against future events or the same damage over and over and over again. There's been significant funding made available through this program. And so FEMA actually has what's called a hazard mitigation grant program that's triggered by a major disaster or a fire management assistance grant. So they will actually look at the costs that they incurred and that you guys incurred to deal with a disaster, and provide a percentage of that on top of those required PA costs through the hazard mitigation grant program. And so, states such as Texas and states that have dealt with this before have an enhanced hazard mitigation plan. So that equates for funding of 20% of the total amount of the disaster assistance provided on the underlying event gets added to the state's coffers to help fund mitigation activities. Luckily enough, when we actually, you're right, all 50 states and territories got declared for COVID, and it's a major disaster. And we were really wondering, well, will that count? Should it count for a hazard mitigation grant? So if you think of all the costs that FEMA incurred and reimbursed states and local governments for COVID, we got 20% of that. That'd be pretty great. And we could do a lot of impactful mitigation. They answered that question last August, that HMGP funding will be made available. It isn't at 20%. That was just too much, but it is a historic amount. So while 4% is lower than what's usually awarded for HMGP, it represents $3.46 billion. So the largest that HMGP allocation ever received. There's some jurisdictions who have never received an HMGP allocation who've now getting this. So historic level of funding available through these programs. The objectives of that are, as we said, build back stronger, be more resilient, promote individual and community safety, help mitigate against the future types of risks that you incurred and the types of damage that you incurred. Again, lessen response and recovery resources. They don't want to have to pay the same amount for a disaster in the same area again. They don't want to keep rebuilding the same school in the same area if we can help mitigate against the threats that they see. So it sounds very basic, and it is. It just has to be a cost-effective way to address the risks posed to a certain facility or a certain community. You do have to provide that it is a cost-effective way to do such, and it will actually mitigate. But really, that's a simple explanation of the program itself. As I mentioned, all states got an HM allocation, including Texas. The application period, was open. It just ended in June. So very anxious to see what Texas does and provides those allocations of the HMGP money to help with some of that. It's a terrific opportunity to really provide some significant mitigation help throughout the state. So what are we talking about? What types of activities can be funded by HMGP? Everything from property acquisition and relocations to elevations. You see, home elevations along the coast and along some of our riverine flooding events, reconstruction, dry proofing of historical structures, generators, safe rooms, flood mitigation risk activities, retrofitting, whether it's hurricane straps or new kind of roofing materials, that kind of thing. I mentioned safe rooms, wind retrofits, soil stabilizations, wildfire mitigations. There's also a great opportunity to get funding for planning to help. And John, if you want to speak to that, I know that's an opportunity that I don't want communities to miss, whereas you may not have been as up to date in years past with your mitigation planning opportunities. This is a great way to fund some of that.
It is, Allison, and the hazard mitigation plans that are required for every community to have in place and updated, or on the 5-year planning cycle, is something a lot of people take advantage of. I would encourage everybody, again, if you miss this opportunity, obviously this is Texas, that there's always a disaster around the corner, and to be able to apply for those funds and talk to the folks at the state and the mitigation branch about applying for those plans or those planning efforts. One of the things I would encourage everybody to do is speak to the emergency management folks who are within your community, or if you're a smaller jurisdiction and part of the county's plan, understanding, make sure you're covered. Maybe you're a lid or a levee improvement district, you're a MUD, you're a municipal utility district, and you want to be a part of your plan. But again, I would encourage you all to look at those, because again, any of these mitigation activities can help lessen the impacts and lessen the amount of potentially debris that is generated by an event.
Absolutely. So know that there's also some HMGP available post-fire. Those are eligible to apply there. Again, you must have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan in order to do that. The applications there's an open application period currently for that. That's why we wanted to mention it through November 1st and to be considered for funding. The types of activities post-fire that you want to think of are wildfire mitigation activities, such as creating defensible space and promoting ignition resistant construction, strengthening and hardening water systems that were burned, and reducing hazardous fuels, reseeding ground cover, things like that, just installing debris traps. So there's lots of things, soil and slope stabilization. There's lots of post-fire mitigation too. I know that seem to be deep into fire season currently. There's tens of thousands of acres burning right now across the country. So wanted to really bring this up as a known risk, but also as it seems to be a growing risk.
All right, Federal Highway Administration. I'll go ahead and jump right into this. So the Federal Highway Administration through the Highway Trust Fund is something that is available for local governments through natural disasters or catastrophic failures, which could be on a individual basis. In 2021, the state of Texas received 26 out of the $100 million for Tropical Storm Imelda, as well as another October flood that occurred here. So something that is pretty regular for communities across the state to see, or communities across the state to see. Next slide, please. Some of the big things here is that this is a program focused on your road infrastructure. As you heard Allison talk about Category C earlier under FEMA, this is an unusually high expense to the state, to the highway agency, and it could be a local government that is classified, a functionally classified road greater than a minor arterial or a minor collector or a major arterial. Next slide. Again, funding available, 100 million is appropriated annually, but that can increase based on congressional appropriation through supplemental appropriations. Oftentimes you see those supplemental appropriations come after a big disaster season, like we saw in 2021, even as far back as 2017 and 2018. In this, we always talk about cost share. You heard about FEMA and their 75% minimum cost share. Here, you look at the federal cost share is 90%, and for all other highways, the federal share is 80%. And when you look at your permanent repairs, it will be at a minimum of 90% of those expenses. One of the things I highly encourage you to do is communicate with the local TxDOT districts, the Texas Department of Transportation. They manage this program, whereas FEMA's programs are managed under the Texas Division of Emergency Management. TxDOT is the coordinator, is the grantee, or if you will, the state coordinator, cognizant agency responsible for this program. So when you look at emergency work, it is that emergency repair required to restore essential traffic. When it comes to debris, that was clarified a few years back, where that would all be funded under FEMA's public assistance program. However, your emergency repairs that may be bringing a road back to one lane of usable traffic, that would obviously be eligible for emergency repairs. And this is something obviously your FEMA teams are going to be looking at, and you're going to need to understand your functional classifications of roads throughout your jurisdiction.
John, the only thing I'd like to highlight here specifically with the intersection of FHWA and FEMA is the FHWA timeframes are very quick. And so just know that if you only have FEMA in mind and only make those claims, and it's somehow in the course of the FEMA review of your damage, it's shown that if it's an FHWA road, you're likely to have missed the deadlines. So it's really important to know that now, and to make those coordination calls now, because you have to know which highways or which roads are eligible for which program, because I would hate for you to miss a funding opportunity due to a deadline. So near and dear to your heart, NRCS, a great program that has had unprecedented funding this year. I know I keep saying that, but it has been amazing as far as how much of a plus up many of these programs have seen.
And when you look at the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, it is that program that's designed to assist with debris removal as well as permanent repairs to your watershed system, or your, again, bayous, creeks, streams, anything that is, again, associated with relieving those imminent threats to public health and safety. We see a lot of this after floods. We saw a lot of it after Hurricane Harvey. One program that came to mind was associated, there in the city of Dickinson, Texas, that leveraged their leverage this program to address some of the debris throughout their community. Yeah, again, when you look at the allocation, it's not necessary for the national emergency to be declared to receive funding for this program. And however, the funding is required through the congressional appropriations. And again, this is something that is done outside of that FEMA program, but it again is something that is going to be looked at throughout the whole of your recovery.
We've seen it very well funding after the events in Louisiana this past couple of years, John. NRCS has received really significant amounts of funding. Hopefully that's precedent setting, and we'll see that this program, it's a great program. It's easier to navigate, and hopefully we'll see it continue to be funding at those rates.
So when you look at, again, cost share, we're always talking about the money and where that's going to be. And again, they may bear up to 75% of the eligible costs. And again, with potential up to 90%. Again, this and when you look at your remaining costs could be coming from local sources, cash or in kind, something that is, again, when you look at this program and you look at how best to approach it, again, we highly encourage you to coordinate with the NRCS coordinator within the state of Texas. And when you design the program and you do ultimately get started. Again, the recovery measures, those that are associated with safeguarding life and property. This is going to require a lot of field inspections, a lot of understanding the scope and magnitude. A lot of times, especially with debris programs that are funded by NRCS, it's very, very difficult to do those initial estimates of just the volume of debris. A lot of these places are hard to get to. We've seen a lot of communities utilize drones or field crews that are out there estimating and pulling this data together. And whether or not you're looking at it on the again lane mile of your arterial, you can look at volumes. I mean, again, it's a unique program. It's not again through a reimbursement program, but it does require funding, and it's something that again, like I said, if you're a community that has a lot of these bayous and a lot of these watershed or water facilities that will be funded by EWP, to understand the key elements of the program that are available. All right, so looking at the eligibility, debris clogged waterways, unstable stream banks. Again, whether it's a toe wall, whether it is something associated, near a bridge or some other water crossing, severe erosion that could impact, houses along an area. Any windborne debris, that could be trees down in an area, or potentially construction and demolition debris, damaged upland sites that are stripped of the vegetation. Anything that is going to impact the ability for that facility to perform its function or perform it safely and convey water throughout the community. There also includes an easement purchase program. Again, something that could be evaluated at the time of disaster, whether or not that is appropriate for the action that is required to be taken.
And we are seeing larger just floodplain and watershed wide initiatives, John, being encouraged, just knowing that because of either buildup of communities or something, that our watersheds look very different, or floodplains are changing. And so this is terrific to keep this in mind, because it's a great opportunity to address the floodplain as it is now.
Great point there. So when it comes to the program itself, it's a damage survey report that you're required to complete, again, on a site-by-site investigation. As I mentioned, this is something that is often one of the most challenging pieces of the program to do. And again, keeping in mind that NRCS will ultimately make that decision and only fund the necessary threats to those facilities. So we have seen from time to time, a larger scope of work be estimated or applied for, and only a portion of it be funded through NRCS. again, something to keep in mind as a bit of a challenge of the program. This is a program that, again, is the state, again, through the NRCS coordinator, are required to submit as far as an application within those 2 calendar years of a disaster. So again, you look at that timeline, and that application must be looking at those statewide costs. So the earlier you can get in line, if you will, the more effective and your application could be. This could apply to public and private landowners, and those sponsors could be any sort of subdivisions of the state. So we've seen the levee improvement districts, we've seen other type of special districts, drainage districts apply for this funding. Those are probably the most common here in the state of Texas, but we have seen a lot of cities and counties, various units of local government apply and be very successful with these programs. All right, and now into the other recovery-related funding, if you will. These are the last portion of our program today. Last 20 minutes or so, we're going to be dedicated to some of the newer programs that are available, and again, are part of that whole community recovery. Allison?
Absolutely, John. And these are, yeah, as you mentioned, won't be your primary, but want to make sure you're aware of them. And so actually gonna quickly go through the first one, just because it is that whole community recovery, but then really dive it further in and use our time to talk about the federal funding sources. So the Housing and Urban Development does have a community development block grant program. It's focused on disaster recovery that offers grants and seed money to start recovery processes. This is your longer term recovery is what I would refer to this as, whereas FEMA public assistance is short term, CDBG DR, while wide ranging in the eligibility of activities is much longer tail on the spend and comes for later in the process. And HUD can help communities and other neighborhoods that might not otherwise fully have the resources to recover. So as I mentioned, it's long-term recovery efforts. It addresses unmet needs that other federal programs have not yet addressed. And it can't supplant other federal programs, but it can supplement and fill in gaps. It includes disaster relief, long-term recovery, restoration of infrastructure. When you read housing and urban development, you may think housing, and that is included there, but it also is infrastructure that leads to whole of community recovery and economic revitalization. We're talking big dollars here, not as big as FEMA public assistance, but significant volume of funding available. You see years in which there's large scale events. 2018 with the $28 billion, that's a wildly large number there, but there were lots of disaster events in 16 and 17, large scale flooding in Louisiana, and many in hurricanes in the 2017 season. We got $5 billion for the events of 20 and 21 that's currently in communities right now, and action plans are being written by those communities about how they will best utilize CDBG-DR funding. So it is allocated by specific appropriation. This is not one of those standby programs necessarily. It is subject to specific appropriation. There's lots of talk right now to switch this to a standing program and not subject to appropriation, because it's very impactful and it's become routine for a lot of disaster prone areas to use. HUD actually calculates announces allocations of the appropriation. They publish a Federal Register notice of which states are getting which amounts, and they also award CDBG funding. It can be to state or local governments. In recent years, we had seen it more exclusively, I would say, to states to administer. But this last season, we actually saw some direct allocations to local governments. And I know, John, you've had experience with that. Do you mind speaking to that and just that's a real sea change?
Sure, and it certainly is. Dating back to 2015 was the last time that a local government was a direct allocatee of disaster recovery funds. That was in Hays County as well as in the city of Houston, including San Marcos. And then from that time forward, allocations have only occurred at the state or Commonwealth level. One of the things we saw in 2021 is that HUD changed their position and is now allocating, or had in 2021, allocated funding to local governments. So the city of Dallas, City of Fort Worth, and the City of Houston all received direct allocation. That was an inclusive of City of Lake Charles, City of Philadelphia, as well as several in the City of New York, to name a few, where there were local jurisdictions receiving these funds. And I think it's important to see that change and to monitor that as you again, as you look at your recovery and understanding what all is going to be involved. The other change I would say is the continued allocation for mitigation dollars. So the CDBG mitigation program, again, is also available. There it is. It is something that we first saw in 2017, and we continue to see today. So that consistent commitment to mitigation. You see the FEMA's community lifelines as a cornerstone of that program is something that continues to be funded today. And when you look at ways to lessen the impact of these disasters, lessen the impact of debris operations, understanding these programs and how they all fit together is an important task.
Definitely. Just a quick comparison. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Oh, no, I was going to say the same thing. Go ahead, Allison.
No, just a quick comparison between the two programs. People are much more familiar, I think, with CDBG-DR, with MIT coming, as John had said, in recent years. Really, CDBG MIT is increasing resilience as opposed to dedicated to recovery. Again, a focus on preventing the risk or mitigating against the risk and preventing the effects. So two very, very important actually $1 trillion plus allocations of funding we want to cover and highlight for you guys. The American Rescue Plan Act that everyone probably on the call has at least heard referenced, and hopefully coming up with plans and spending these dollars in your communities. $1.9 trillion to mitigate against the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's 4 broad uses of ARPA funds, and we want to bring this up because this is terrific latitude given to state and local governments to use state and local fiscal recovery dollars in very wide-ranging ways. And so to respond to the negative impacts and help affected industries, premium pay, budget shortfalls, and water, sewer, broadband infrastructure. We actually just heard from FEMA that the category C, they're addressing budget shortfalls that would include budget shortfalls due to having to meet cost shares of other federal programs. And so again, latitude being provided there. The federal government is really highlighting they want you to use this funding as broadly as you can to really address what your community is facing. Of the $1.9 trillion, $565 billion was available to state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. Just a wild amount. In addition to the $350 billion available through the state and local fiscal recovery fund, an additional $130 billion in school districts, a lot of investments in public transit, direct affected industries such as restaurants and bars and small businesses got a direct allocation, and then an additional plus up of the paycheck protection program, the PPP program. The great part about that, this is ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds. Everyone gets their own pot of money. So the state got an allocation in 2 tranches. Actually, we're coming upon year 2, where the second half of the allocations to states will be made available. Local governments got their own allocations. There's no applying to states to do it, to get your money and have to justify. Metropolitan cities got a direct allocation. Counties got a direct allocation, and even non-entitlement units. While the money does come through the states, there are specific allocations for local non-entitlement units, and again in 2 tranches. Great part about this is you have some flexibility as far as timelines. Funds don't have to be obligated until December of 24, and you have until December of 2026 to expend the funds. The IIJA was also, again, $1 trillion plus program or allocation of funding for some of the same purposes you'll see: clean water, broadband access, electrical grid renewal, and transportation and roads. So we've mentioned FHWA and NRCS and some funding and some existing programs that were plussed up by these appropriations. So half of the IIJA funding will flow to the Department of Transportation. About $550 billion of it was newly authorized spending on top of what Congress already authorizes. So it's funding for about 375 programs, but about 125 of them are new. So we're really anticipating the funding coming through IIJA to hit the streets a little sooner. I mean, this is plussing up existing programs. This is not recreating or creating new programs. They're not even recreating the wheel. They're just funding, they're just throwing more money at existing programs. So there's already the structure in place. You already the same application processes and same access points. So as I was just mentioning, about 55 to 65% of the allocation will be parceled out according to formulas. So as I said, it should be hitting your coffers and the coffers of federal cognizant agencies that you can access really quickly. And about the other 35 to 45% are going to be distributed through grants to state and local governments. So those will be a little slower, have to be rolled out by those specific agencies. But you'll see that half the money is just according to formulas that are pre-existing. John, do you have a comment on that?
Oh, no, I just know that there's a lot going to be coming to FEMA. And I think that's where we're taking. Oh, yep. There it is.
Yep. Speaking of plussing up existing programs. Yep, it looks like FEMA also was the beneficiary of some significant IIJA funding, an unprecedented volume of funding made available to FEMA's flood mitigation assistance program, $3.5 billion. Another $1 billion to FEMA's Building Resilience in Communities program that they announced a couple years ago. Again, a pretty significant program developed by FEMA to build resilience, to provide mitigation dollars. And through this funding, they got an extra $1 billion. And then in response to the concerns of a lot of local communities, FEMA established a revolving loan fund to help fund the non-federal cost share for hazard mitigation activities. So that was created by the Storm Act, and then IIJA provided another $500 million into that revolving loan fund. So they're still developing rules to access that revolving loan fund, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. But they did hear the concerns as far as access to our federal cost share. As I mentioned, FEMA FMA was plussed up an additional $200 million in 20, $160 million in 21. It's not as heavily utilized as FEMA would like to see. 26 states didn't even submit applications in 2020, and 31 states didn't apply in 2021. So, but they did choose to provide an amazing $700 million for the next 5 years, and provided for an increased cost share for those socially vulnerable or areas of where a low, medium, average income or medium income areas. So not increased cost share there. And then we also now have the revolving loan fund available to address the remaining cost share. FEMA is also testing an initiative to streamline funding, FMA funding. They're calling it very pithy, calling it Swift Current. But trying to streamline access to FMA funding. And so right now, FEMA's allocated $60 million to 4 different states that were affected by Hurricane Ida and have really high repetitive or severe repetitive loss number of properties, and a total number of highest total number of insurance claims in those FEMA regions. So if this model or if this pilot really works well and they're able to successfully get money on the street more quickly, I anticipate some of the lessons learned from Swift Current to be incorporated into the FMA program as a whole. As I mentioned, BRIC, really FEMA's investment in resilience is what I'll refer to as BRIC. Again, 6% of any underlying federal disaster grants are going to be set aside for additional mitigation activities and building resilience in communities. We already had $1.8 billion set aside, and then an additional $500 million was made available in fiscal year 20. And as I mentioned, through IIJA, another $1 billion. So a very well-funded program through a variety of funding sources. So as I mentioned, the $500 million a year has really been the traditional set aside for these types of activities. Now we're talking almost $3 billion or $3 billion plus there. So really expect a robust utilization of the brick project or brick program as well. It does focus on those community lifelines, just like we saw HUD CDBG mitigation. So really FEMA has identified these as critical lifelines to communities post-disaster that really are the bedrock of our society as a whole, really. And FEMA's really making investments to help shore up those community lifelines. Really getting to the end here, but wanted to highlight this for you guys because I would, and FEMA had heard this, and I don't want a cost share to be a barrier to access for any of this money, and neither do they. And so they created this revolving loan fund. They had only funded it at $100 million in 22 and 23, but IIJA, as I mentioned, dropped an extra $500 million into that revolving loan fund. So FEMA is getting a lot of pressure to stand up the program and quickly implement it. They're saying first NOFO should be issued next year, but this is really to address access to these funds to help you fund your cost share. So John, that's a great highlight of kind of the smattering of other programs.
It is, and with the last 5 minutes, I would ask everybody if you wouldn't mind sharing any questions or comments through the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We did have one that one of the attendees, Sharon Shapiro, has highlighted or she identified earlier, which was a comment about the Federal Highway Administration's ER program and about their deadlines and the requirements for applications to be submitted within 30 days. And yes, in fact, every one of these programs has their own timelines and everything move. It's a lot of hurry up and wait. A lot of these programs do have some very fast deadlines when it comes to applying and doing those initial assessments. And then there is oftentimes, I want to manage everybody's expectation, there is that long period where, whether it's a congressional appropriation, application, approval, you may be waiting for a request for information, an RFI that gets issued to you, that those things, every one of these grants do take time. And so when it comes to disaster funding and these programs, a lot of great insights I think were presented here today. I think it may be a good catalyst for you as your community to be able to get that dialogue going about how your community may be impacted. As I wait for any questions, I want to share one story about one of the commissioners in Bastrop County. Carla was the commissioner there, and she actually was spearheaded the wildfire program, and I think that was in 2011, following the Bastrop complex wildfire. And one of the things that we had seen, and she shared with me, was the fact that within that community, the debris removal effort was a $10-20+ million effort, and that spurred an opportunity to build back better and continue to have that mitigation mindset. So there's there is that opportunity that I don't want you as a local government to miss out on. Because there's Commissioner Beckett has just really taken the ball and run with it. They're a great success story of how these disasters can spur something better, in the future. Let's see. One question is: a recorded version of the webinar will be available for further review, and for that, I'll ask Wendy if you'd like to answer that question about how attendees can see this recording again.
Yes, so as long as Zoom hasn't failed us and the recording comes out okay, we'll be posting the video on the H-GAC YouTube channel. So you can always go back, or if someone didn't attend, they can always go and look at it.
Excellent, thank you. All right, well, we're coming up on the, and the copy of the slides. Wendy, will that be available as well?
Yes, that will be posted on our website.
Excellent, excellent. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate your attendance and your attention to this, and we will see you soon. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.